I never expected to
You don't
share
have to
my
trust me. I
solitude with a
just
wild
hope
predator.
you're safe.
When I signed the papers for the little desert cabin nestled along the northern edge of Joshua Tree, I was chasing a quiet kind of dream, not one that involved sharp claws and an attitude.
You're really
I was
trusting me, aren't
28,
you?
newly single, burnt out from freelancing in Los Angeles, and halfway through writing a novel no one had asked for. All I wanted was dry air, wide sky, and silence that wasn't broken by car alarms or my neighbor's endlessly barking Pomeranian. Instead, I got a roommate, a four-legged, spotted one with opinions. It started with a dumb city habit I didn't shake. Back in LA, I used to leave out food for strays, mostly skittish cats that lived around my old apartment building. After moving, I kept doing it out of routine more than anything. I'd toss a bit of kibble or scraps out by the low stone wall that edged the sandy drive. I figured maybe a desert hare or two would benefit. I was wrong. One morning in mid-October, before the sun got too aggressive, I stepped out with my coffee and saw her. At first, I thought it was a large feral cat. But something was off. She was far too muscular, with a low-slung, deliberate walk. Her coat was a golden tan, marked with dark rosettes like an artist had dotted her fur with ink. And those ears, triangular, twitching, with delicate black tufts at the tips. A bobcat, a real honest-to-God desert bobcat. She was maybe 10 yards away, standing with one paw halfway in the air, staring at me as if I were the surprise, not her. I froze, coffee halfway to my lips. She didn't bolt, just watched. Her eyes were this fierce, sunlit amber. Curious, calculating, wild. Hi, I said, like a total idiot. You're not a bunny. She blinked once. Then, with the slow confidence of someone very much in charge, she turned and padded toward the food I'd left, sniffed it, and began to eat. Every few bites, she'd glance up at me, watching, measuring. I stayed perfectly still, heart doing odd gymnastics behind my ribs. That night, I fell into an internet rabbit hole of desert wildlife. Bobcats, it turns out, are notoriously elusive, solitary, private, and rarely this bold around people. But 2 mornings later, she came back. This time I was ready. I'd swapped the dry kibble for fresh raw chicken thighs from the market in Yucca Valley. Ridiculous, I know. But something told me she deserved the good stuff. She appeared with no fanfare, drifting in from the shadows beyond the creosote bushes like a ghost. This time, instead of diving in, she sat beside the food. Just sat, waiting, staring at me again with those unreadable molten eyes. So I named her. Call me sentimental, but I needed something to call her besides the Queen of the Desert. I landed on Juniper, after the twisted old tree outside my bedroom window. Something wild, but rooted. I didn't tell anyone about her at first. I mean, who wants to be the weirdo, new-in-town lady feeding a bobcat? Well, turns out, the town already had opinions about me. "Miss Ava, you don't want to encourage things that bite," said Tom, the checker at the local feed store, when he saw the raw meat in my basket. "You'll end up on the evening news." But Juniper didn't bite. She watched. She ate. She came and went with a dignity I envied, and over time she got closer. By early November, she was eating just a dozen feet from my front steps. I never tried to touch her. I'm not that naive, but there was something between us. A mutual allowance. I respected her space. She tolerated mine. Still, I knew this was her land. I was just the temporary visitor with a fridge full of chicken. But then something shifted. She got rounder. I don't mean fat. Not really. But she started moving slower, eating less, being pickier, like turning her nose up at beef, for crying out loud. One morning she even growled at me when I stepped a little too close. It wasn't a big warning, more like a back off, 2 legs. But it was new. And then one morning, she didn't come at all. No soft paws on gravel. No sharp amber gaze peeking from the brush. The food I'd left stayed untouched, drying in the sun. I told myself it was fine. Wild animals roam, but by the next day, nothing again. On the third morning, I felt ridiculous. But I grabbed my boots, some water, and a small flashlight just in case. And I walked. Out past the yucca groves, down a dry wash, toward the edge of the real desert, the kind where even the lizards give you side-eye. I didn't expect to find her. It was just, I couldn't sit still. And then I heard it. The tiniest rustle, like soft fur brushing against dry leaves. And there she was, Juniper. She looked tired, dusty, thinner, but alive. And something was different. She had something in her mouth, not food, something small, squirming, a kitten, a bobcat kitten. That was the moment the story changed. I stood behind a crooked mesquite, heart in my throat, watching Juniper carry the tiny thing across the rocks like it was made of glass. She moved with such care, every step deliberate, every glance alert. She didn't seem surprised to see me. She didn't hiss, didn't growl. She just looked at me. For a long moment, our eyes locked, and something passed between us, a kind of understanding. Or maybe that was just me projecting like a lunatic. Still holding the kitten, Juniper padded toward a cluster of weather-worn boulders near a long-dead Joshua tree. At the base, beneath a tangle of roots and dry brush, she disappeared into a hollow space barely big enough for a laundry basket. I waited, counted to 30. Then I crept forward, not too close, just far enough to peer around a cactus and see what she was up to. And that's when I heard them. Tiny sounds, mewling, 3, maybe 4 different pitches, all soft and breathy and impossibly fragile. She had more than one. Juniper emerged a minute later without the kitten. She stretched, tired, wary, and for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't walk away. She just sat beside the den, her tail twitching slowly, scanning the horizon like a soldier on post. I didn't say anything, just backed away slowly, heart pounding, mind racing. So it wasn't just her anymore. I wasn't feeding a wild animal out of guilt or boredom. I was supporting a mother, a provider, a creature who'd decided, for whatever mysterious reason, that I was safe enough to be near while she raised her children in the dirt and wind. That night, I couldn't sleep. A storm was coming, the desert kind, low and sudden with angry skies and sideways rain. I'd seen the warnings on my phone, flash floods, winds strong enough to snap power poles. I kept thinking about those kittens under that tree, about the water that could rush down the washes and turn that hollow into a muddy trap. At 4 a.m., I made a decision, one that, in hindsight, was probably more heart than head. I grabbed a thick blanket, a flashlight, and a big plastic storage bin I used for firewood. I cleared out the logs, lined it with towels and fleece, then stood in the doorway with the wind pushing at my back and thought, this is crazy. And I went anyway. It took me nearly 30 minutes to find the den again in the pre-dawn dark. The wind howled like something ancient. Lightning flickered on the horizon, painting the rocks in sharp relief. I crouched 20 feet from the boulders and whispered into the air. I felt ridiculous. What did I expect? That she'd wave me over? But then, rustling, Juniper appeared from the shadow of the den. Her ears twitched in the wind, and her eyes caught my flashlight beam like 2 golden coins. She didn't move toward me, didn't run, just watched. I brought something, I said softly. I slid the blanket toward her in the sand, inch by inch, then backed away. She didn't react, just turned and disappeared back into the hollow. I waited. Rain started to spit from the sky. Then, slowly, like she was considering it, Juniper stepped out and tugged the blanket into the den with her teeth. It felt like a miracle or an invitation. The next day, after the storm had blown through and the clouds lifted, I returned. Not too close, just enough to check. The blanket was still inside. The ground around the den was muddy, but not flooded. And when I left food on my porch that evening, Juniper came. She ate quickly. Then, instead of finishing the meal, she picked up a piece of chicken and trotted back toward the rocks. From that moment on, everything changed. Every morning, she'd show up, eat, and carry food back. I'd leave more the next day. I didn't see the kittens again, but I heard them. I imagined them growing, feeding, wrestling in the shadows, while their mother trusted a strange human enough to accept help. And then, 1 week later, just as the last puddles were drying up, Juniper surprised me again. She didn't show up in the morning or afternoon, but at dusk, as I sat on my porch pretending not to worry, I saw a shadow moving through the brush. Juniper. And behind her, 3 bobcat kittens. They were about the size of house cats, but clumsier, their paws too big for their legs, tails flicking with curiosity. Their eyes, wide and uncertain, scanned everything like it might bite them. Except me. They walked right up to the porch, stopping just at the edge of the steps. Juniper turned to them, then to me, and gave the softest sound. Almost a grunt, like she was saying, "Well, you gonna open the door or what?" And that's how it began. I left the front door open, more out of instinct than planning. I wasn't sure what Juniper would do, or what I'd do if she actually came inside. But she did. Cautiously, she stepped over the threshold, her paws nearly silent on the wood floor. The kittens didn't follow immediately. They stayed bunched up at the bottom step, blinking up at me like they were unsure if this was some elaborate trap. Juniper gave them another grunt, firmer this time, and one by one, they scrambled up after her. They were all legs and fur and oversized ears. 2 boys and a girl, if I had to guess. The smallest one, the girl, had a pale crescent-shaped smudge on her forehead, almost like a moon. I mentally named her Luna. Inside, Juniper did a perimeter check like she was a security guard on shift. She sniffed corners, eyed the fireplace, even hopped up briefly onto the windowsill to scan the outside. And then, to my complete disbelief, she curled up on the rug by the fire and yawned. I nearly dropped the tray of water I was carrying. The kittens, meanwhile, were in chaos mode, tumbling over each other, smacking things with their paws, chasing dust motes like they'd invented gravity. I kept my distance, moving slowly, speaking softly. My voice had become a kind of soundtrack to them by then, a presence they knew, even if they didn't fully understand. I stayed on the far side of the living room for the most part, only stepping in to place down water and a little more food. Juniper didn't object. She watched me carefully, yes, but not like prey. More like a neighbor keeping an eye on someone borrowing her garden hose. That first night, they stayed until nearly midnight. Then, without warning, Juniper stood, stretched, and padded toward the door. The kittens followed, yawning and stumbling, and together they vanished into the cool desert dark. It became a routine. Sometimes they'd show up in the early evening, sometimes just before dawn. I stopped trying to predict it and just left the door cracked open when I was home. The front room became their hangout, a little oasis of warmth and safety. I started calling it the den. There were moments of light-hearted chaos, like the night one of the boys leapt onto the couch, misjudged the distance, and skidded face first into a stack of my notebooks. Or the time Luna climbed onto my laptop and deleted half a paragraph of my manuscript. Honestly, it was better than what I'd written. But there were also quiet, almost sacred moments. Like when Juniper sat beside me while I read aloud, her body curled protectively around her sleeping kittens. Or when Luna crept into my lap one night and fell asleep, her tiny claws flexing unconsciously against my jeans. I knew I was walking a line, a blurry, controversial one. This wasn't how people were supposed to interact with wild animals. I wasn't a licensed rehabber. I wasn't a ranger. I was just a writer with too much empathy and too few boundaries. But I wasn't treating them like pets. I wasn't trying to domesticate them. I didn't touch Juniper, didn't try to cage them, didn't even give them collars or toys. I simply opened my home to them when they wanted it, for as long as they needed. Still, I knew it couldn't last. They were growing fast. By January, the boys had nearly doubled in size. Their teeth were sharper, their play fights more intense. Juniper had started taking them out for longer stretches, sometimes overnight, sometimes for full days. She was teaching them to hunt, to survive, to be bobcats. Luna stayed behind more often than the boys. She would nap in my reading chair or watch the fire with her chin resting on her paws. She followed Juniper less and less, preferring to curl up beside me while I worked. Sometimes she'd bat at the cursor on my screen with her paw, mesmerized by the blinking. I knew what was happening, I just didn't want to name it yet. They were starting to separate. Wild things don't stay, not forever. One morning, Juniper arrived alone. No kittens. She ate in silence, then stretched out on the porch in the sun, looking content. Not worried, not anxious, just calm. I told myself not to worry either. But when another day passed and the boys didn't show up, I felt the ache settle deep in my chest. And then came the night Luna didn't come. I waited up for her longer than I care to admit. The house was too quiet without the usual soft thumps of paws, the scratchy rustle of little claws exploring under the couch, or the occasional crash that meant another ceramic mug had died a noble death. I left the door open just a crack, the fire low, and sat there in my threadbare sweatshirt, pretending to read, but really just listening. Every gust of wind, every scrape of a branch outside made my heart stutter. But Luna didn't come. The next morning, Juniper showed up at dawn, alone again. She looked toward the house, then toward the ridges behind it. She gave a soft growl. Not angry, just expectant, as if to say, "It's time." I knew what that meant. The boys were gone, probably staking out their own corners of the desert now, doing what young bobcats do. Chasing jackrabbits, climbing rocks, marking territory that would someday be theirs alone. And Luna? Maybe she was just behind them. Or maybe she wasn't ready yet. 2 more days passed. I tried not to spiral. Then, just as the sun was tipping below the rock spires and the air turned that crisp lavender gray that only happens in the desert, I heard it. A soft, deliberate thump at the window. And there she was. Luna. Older, bigger, but unmistakably her. That little moon-white mark on her forehead gleamed in the twilight. She hesitated at the sill, blinking into the living room like she wasn't sure the door was still open, metaphorically or literally. "It's open," I whispered, and she stepped inside. That night, Luna curled up beside me on the couch, purring softly. Yes, bobcats purr, and it's low and rough and somehow even more soothing than a domestic cat's. I felt her weight lean into my side as I sat there, breathing slower than I had in days. But this time I didn't fool myself. I knew it was temporary, and sure enough, as spring started to push its fingers through the cracks in the dry earth, tiny flowers bursting out of nowhere, bees buzzing like tiny engines. Luna started staying away longer. She'd vanish for a full day, then return, then 2 days, then 3. Each time she came back, she looked a little more like Juniper, sleek, confident, less clumsy, and then she didn't come back at all. That last night, I didn't know it was the last night. That's the thing about goodbyes in the wild. They don't come with speeches. No dramatic music, no lingering glances over the shoulder, just an open door, and then silence. Juniper, though, kept coming. Always at dusk, always alone. Sometimes she'd stay just a few minutes, eat a bit, then disappear. Other times she'd lie on the porch for an hour or two, half asleep, soaking in the quiet like it was sunlight. She looked peaceful. I think we both were. That spring, I stopped leaving food out every day. Not because I didn't want to, but because Juniper didn't need it. She'd become more selective again, more independent. A visitor, not a dependent. And then, in mid-May, I noticed something I hadn't expected. She was getting round again. It started subtly. The same pickiness, the slower walk, the occasional soft growl when I got too close with the wrong kind of food. But I recognized the signs this time. The nesting behavior. The way she started pawing at the base of the creosote bushes near the old shed I hadn't used in months. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the San Bernardino Mountains and the air turned gold and still, she sat by the shed door and stared at me. I stood there, chicken in one hand, trying to decipher that gaze. "You want to do this again?" I asked. She blinked, and I smiled. I spent the next 2 days fixing up the shed. I added insulation, dragged in an old dog crate, lined it with fleece blankets, even cut a little door into the side wall, so Juniper could come and go without stepping through the main entrance. I didn't invite her, I just made it ready, and on the third morning, the shed door was slightly ajar. Tufts of fur dusted the floor. One of the blankets had been rearranged. She had moved in, not with me, but near me, close enough to trust, far enough to still be wild. By late June, the summer heat was rising like a tide over the desert. Cicadas screamed from the creosote bushes, and even the jackrabbits seemed slower, their ears drooping like flags in still air. Inside the shed, it was cooler, barely, but shaded and quiet. I didn't peek. I didn't have to. Juniper kept to herself in those weeks, only emerging at dawn or dusk to eat or stretch under the big Palo Verde tree near the porch. She'd grown heavier, but not sluggish. There was always a coiled readiness in her movements, like a spring loaded under her spine. She was a mother again. I just hadn't seen the proof yet. Until one sticky morning in early July. I was drinking my second cup of coffee on the porch when I heard it. A sound like the softest sneeze. Then another. I stood slowly, held my breath, and turned toward the shed. Juniper was nudging the door open with her shoulder, just enough to slide out sideways. And behind her, stumbling on unsteady legs, came the tiniest bobcat kitten I'd ever seen. Then another and another. 3 in total. My heart swelled so fast it almost hurt. They were fuzzy and awkward, their spots still hazy, eyes wide and unblinking as they tumbled over each other like overcooked biscuits. One tried to pounce on a pebble and fell flat on its face. The smallest one mewled in frustration until Juniper picked it up by the scruff and repositioned it under the shade. I didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. The porch had become my quiet chapel, and this was the holiest moment I'd witnessed all year. Juniper didn't even look at me. Not at first. She busied herself licking the smallest one clean, keeping them in a tight little triangle of shade. Only after a few minutes did she glance my way, briefly, calmly, then look back to her babies. It felt like permission. Not to interfere, but to be present. That afternoon, I left a fresh blanket by the shed's side entrance. Nothing fancy, just soft and clean. The next morning, it was gone. Or rather, pulled fully inside. And so it began again. That summer melted by like candle wax. The kittens, 2 males and a female, I suspected, grew in the usual blend of chaos and elegance. Juniper brought them to the edge of the porch once a week or so. They didn't come inside like the first litter. Not yet. But they played under the deck, pounced on beetles, clawed at the rug I'd laid on the porch steps. Sometimes they'd watch me through the window while I worked. Those round yellow eyes blinking slowly, as if they were studying my habits the way I'd studied theirs. And just like before, one of them stood out, the little female. She had the same creamy forehead blaze as Luna, though smaller. I called her Mira, short for miracle. She was the boldest of the bunch, first to climb the porch, first to chase her tail in circles until she toppled over, first to stare me down like I was the one who needed taming. I found myself talking to her when no one was around. "Careful, kid," I'd murmur when she tried to scale a flower pot. "You're not as sneaky as you think." Juniper, for her part, seemed more relaxed this time around. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was familiarity. Or maybe she understood now that this place, this weird, semi-human oasis in the desert, was safe. By August, the kittens were nearly half grown. Their clumsy stage gave way to a kind of rhythmic grace. I'd catch them shadow hunting in the yard at dusk, mimicking Juniper's stalking posture with adorable failure. They were learning from her, from the land, from the silence. One evening, as a rare monsoon rolled through with its strange perfume of ozone and sagebrush, I stood by the screen door and watched Juniper lead her trio back to the shed, Mira trotting behind, her little legs working overtime. And for the first time, I felt something that surprised me. Not sadness, not worry, pride. This was her world. I was just lucky enough to witness it. Fall in the desert comes in whispers. There's no sudden chill, no golden leaves spiraling from tall maples like back east. Instead, the wind shifts, drier, quieter. The shadows grow longer in the late afternoon, and even the cactus wrens seem to pause between songs. It was during this hush of a season that the next chapter of Juniper's story began to write itself. By late September, the kittens had grown lanky and sharp-eyed. They didn't wobble anymore when they walked. They moved with that same ghost-like glide their mother had, heads low, tails flicking, muscles coiled beneath their fur. Juniper brought them around less often. It was like watching a teacher step back as the students took their first real tests. They would go out alone now, for hours at a time, reappearing dusty and panting, their faces glowing with something that looked very much like pride. Mira still visited the porch. Sometimes she'd stretch out under my deck chair like it was her personal cave. Other times, she'd perch on the windowsill and watch me write, her head tilting with every keystroke. I never tried to touch her. Not once, but I talked to her often. "You've got your mom's stare, you know that?" She'd blink slowly, like she already knew. Juniper, meanwhile, had reclaimed her own rhythm. She'd show up at dusk, take a small bite to eat, then sit on the porch roof like a desert gargoyle, watching the horizon. She wasn't parenting anymore, not actively. She was observing. One evening in early October, she came alone. No kittens. She looked at the window, then at me, then back at the porch steps. Something was different. I stepped outside quietly. She didn't move, and then I saw it. Her body, just slightly rounder again. Her pace, a little slower. Her patience, deeper. I couldn't help it. I laughed softly. "You're kidding me." She wasn't. It hit me then. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a one-time miracle or a quirky wildlife story. This was a pattern, a cycle. Juniper had chosen this place, not just once, but again and again. And maybe I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I'd already upgraded the shed, added better insulation, patched the gaps, even installed a solar-powered fan for the hottest days. But now I took it a step further. I built a second den, this one tucked beneath the old deck, framed with reclaimed wood and lined with soft wool rugs I no longer used. It was hidden from view, but easy for her to access. A perfect nursery. And then I waited. October passed. The days shortened. I wrote more, drank too much coffee, and found myself glancing at the porch every hour without meaning to. Juniper came and went, sometimes with Mira, sometimes alone. Never with all three kittens again. I figured the boys had moved on for good. I told myself I was fine with that. But on Halloween, a night usually filled with costumed chaos and porch lights, My cabin remained dark and still. I sat on the porch, sipping something warm, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of small paws. I turned, expecting Mira. Instead, I saw 3 kittens, brand new, barely old enough to walk, tumbling after Juniper as she calmly led them from the deck entrance into the open night. And behind them, Mira, sitting tall at the edge of the porch, watching them with the same alert posture her mother once had. Her eyes met mine, and I swear to God she looked proud. Not of me, of them. Juniper nudged one of the kits forward as it tried to chew on a pine cone. Mira circled the smallest one and gave it a gentle tap with her paw when it strayed toward the bushes. They were doing it together, mother and daughter, both raising the next generation. I didn't cry, but my throat tightened so much I couldn't speak. I just sat there in the cool desert wind, surrounded by silence and fur, and the quiet unfolding of something deeply rare. A second chance, a second litter, a second story beginning, and me, still lucky enough to be part of it. The second litter grew up fast. Maybe it was the milder winter that followed, or maybe Juniper and Mira had become an unstoppable parenting duo. Either way, the 3 new Bobcat kits were bounding through the yard like tumbleweeds by early January. I called them the Cactus Crew. One had a stubby ear, probably from some early scuffle, and a knack for falling off ledges with shocking confidence. Another was obsessed with chasing shadows, often spinning in dizzying circles until it collapsed in a heap of fur and confusion. The third, the smallest, had a white-tipped tail that bobbed like a signal flag whenever she ran. I didn't name them. Not this time. I knew better now. The bond was still real, still deep, but I had learned the difference between welcoming something wild and trying to hold it. They weren't mine. They never would be. But they were part of my life. That was enough. Juniper stayed in the background more this time. She'd watch from the shade while Mira did most of the chasing, the correcting, the careful herding. It was a strange and beautiful thing to witness. The daughter stepping into the mother's role. The generational handoff playing out not in words, but in body language and silent understanding. Every few days, Mira would sit by my porch swing as if giving me a break report. She didn't meow. Bobcats don't meow like house cats. They grunt. They chirp. They make sounds like a mix between a pigeon and a small engine starting up. But I swear, I understood her. They're wild as heck, her eyes seemed to say, but they're learning. You should see how fast the little one is. I'd nod like a fool and sip my tea. Doing a good job, kid. And so the winter passed. Not in the quiet solitude I once craved, but in the rich, textured rhythm of life. Sometimes the porch would be empty for days. I never panicked anymore. I just trusted the cycle. Other times I'd wake up to paw prints in the sand, or find a chewed-up cactus pod on my doormat like a weird desert gift. Then came the spring again. A year since Juniper first appeared on my property. I hadn't marked the date in my calendar, but I felt it in my bones. She still visited. Not daily, but often enough. She'd show up in the cool hours, lie by the side of the porch where the wood soaked up the sun, and watch the horizon. She looked older now, her face sharper, her movements slower. But her eyes, those endless amber eyes, were just as bright. Mira was now fully grown. She still had that crescent mark on her forehead, though it had faded slightly. She'd started staying away longer again, sometimes 3 days, sometimes a full week, and I knew. The inevitable was near. She'd be leaving soon, finding her own range, her own rocky corners of the desert to raise her own crew, perhaps far from here. Maybe she'd remember this cabin. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, she had everything she needed. And so did I. That May, just as the desert bloomed with stubborn wildflowers and the lizards began their daily sun rituals, Mira came one last time. I didn't know it was the last. You never do. She sat on the porch for almost an hour, longer than she'd stayed in months. I sat nearby, cross-legged, reading a book I couldn't focus on. She glanced at me now and then, not urgently, not sadly, just present. When she stood to go, she looked back once. A long, steady look that landed right in the center of my chest. Then she turned toward the east and vanished into the rocks, her tail flicking once behind her. I whispered after her, "Good luck, Luna's girl," and the porch fell quiet. Summer came in a blaze that year. The kind of heat that hums in the air before noon and lingers long after the stars come out. Everything slowed down, even the birds, even time. And though the days were thick with silence, I didn't feel alone. Juniper still came. Not every day, but often enough that I never had to wonder if she was gone for good. Sometimes she'd arrive just before sunset, walking up the path like she owned the place, which, let's be honest, she did. She was heavier again, rounder in the middle, and this time I didn't laugh. I just stood there on the porch and whispered, "Of course you are." It had been nearly 2 full years since I'd moved to the desert, thinking I was escaping everything. The noise, the city, the heartbreak, the pressure. And instead, I'd found a family. Not the kind with holiday dinners or shared genetics, but a family nonetheless. One evening, not long after the monsoon swept through with their bone-shaking thunder and sudden walls of rain, I noticed the signs. Juniper had vanished. No footprints, no food taken, no soft grunts in the distance. For 3 days, I didn't see her. I tried not to panic. I told myself the same things I'd told myself the first time. Bobcats are private. Birth is a vulnerable thing. She knows what she's doing. Still, I kept the light on the porch, low and warm. I left the best pieces of chicken in the bowl. I opened the side gate near the shed. And then, just before dawn on the 4th day, I heard it. The sound of paws, then claws, then the soft thump of something being carried. I peered through the screen door. Juniper was there, her coat wet, her eyes wild. And in her mouth was a tiny damp ball of fur, a newborn. She looked at the porch, at me, then at the shed. I opened the door. She didn't hesitate. She marched past me, her body low and urgent, and disappeared into the shed. A few minutes later, she came out again, paused, and gave me a look I'd only seen once before. The very first time she'd trusted me enough to share her world. Then she disappeared into the desert again. She returned with another, and another. 3 in total, again. She was doing it all over. I didn't cry, but I smiled so wide my face ached. I didn't know what had happened to the cactus crew. If they'd wandered off. If they'd claimed new territory farther out. If Mira was raising kits of her own beneath some distant ridge. I only knew that Juniper had chosen me again, or maybe not me. Maybe just this place. This tiny sliver of desert that offered warmth and safety and food and, if I was lucky, a soft place to land. I stood at the edge of the porch, barefoot on the wood, watching the shed as the sun cracked open the morning sky. 3 litters, dozens of moments, a cycle of life so perfectly timed, I felt like I was living inside a story nature had written long before I arrived. And still, every part of it felt brand new. It's been 3 full years now, since Juniper first stepped onto my dusty little property, with her fierce eyes and cautious grace. 3 years, 3 litters, and more quiet moments of trust than I could ever count. I used to mark time with deadlines, edits, city noise. Now I mark it with paw prints in the dirt and the soft sounds of breathing beneath my porch. The 3rd litter, which I secretly called the Sunset Trio, is almost grown now. They've taken to perching on the rocks at dusk like little stone guardians, watching the world with expressions far too serious for their age. One of them, a lanky male with oversized paws and a tail that never quite stops twitching, has taken to watching me from the roof. I don't know if he's curious or judging my posture. Possibly both. He's got Juniper's glare and Mira's mischievous streak. I call him Trouble. Silently, respectfully. Another, the shyest one, has a jagged white stripe across her shoulder. She flinches at loud noises, but follows her mother everywhere, like a shadow. I've never gotten closer than 20 feet to her, but sometimes she'll sit on the edge of the garden, staring at the wind chimes. And the third, a boy with black-tipped ears and a bold, bounding gait, reminds me of the first kitten I ever saw Juniper carry across the rocks. His curiosity burns bright. He's the one who pawed at the water bowl for a full 5 minutes one day, baffled by his own reflection. Juniper, now visibly older, has begun to step back. Not fully. She still growls when they misbehave, still corrals them with gentle bumps of her head. But she doesn't chase them anymore. Doesn't run with them through the creosote bushes or wrestle like she used to. She's become the matriarch, the observer. The living legacy of a story few people would ever believe. Sometimes, when the kittens are off exploring and the heat has softened into dusk, she'll sit beside my chair on the porch. Close, but not touching. We'll just sit there together, watching the sky melt into orange and lavender, listening to the rustle of something small in the brush. I talk to her sometimes. Not full conversations. I'm not that far gone, but soft thoughts, simple things. You've done good, Juniper. They're strong. I'm proud of you. She never answers, obviously. But I swear, sometimes she blinks just slowly enough that it feels like she hears me. And maybe in her wild way, she does. That fall, I started writing again. Not the novel I abandoned years ago. That ship sailed. But essays, letters, pieces of this strange, healing, entirely unexpected life I've built in the desert, with a bobcat for a neighbor, a porch for a nursery, and a heart that feels fuller than it ever did, surrounded by people. I never post them, never share. But I keep them in a weathered notebook by my bed. The covers scratched from a certain kitten's claws, the corners chewed by what I assume was a curious ground squirrel. And the pages are smudged with dirt and tea. But it's mine, and it's enough. One morning in November, I woke up to silence. No pause, no rustling, no amber eyes peeking through the sagebrush. The shed was empty. The porch was still. Even the water bowl sat untouched. I sat with that silence for a long time, not with fear or even sadness, but with respect. They'd moved on, all of them. The desert had called them elsewhere. The way it does, the way it's supposed to, and I let them go. Winter returned like a sigh. Cooler nights, softer winds, the kind of stillness that feels like it's waiting for something. I settled into the quiet again. Just me and the old cabin, the creaking porch, and the wide desert sky. Some nights, I'd wake up thinking I heard claws on the windowsill or soft chirps near the shed. But it was just the wind, or the memory of sound. I wasn't lonely, though. Their absence wasn't emptiness. It was something else. A kind of fullness that stayed, even when they were gone. Juniper had taught me that. That trust isn't always loud. That connection doesn't always mean possession. That sometimes the most powerful relationships come with no expectations, no promises, just presence. And presence, it turns out, is everything. Still, on certain nights, the kind with a full moon casting silver light across the sands and the Joshua trees standing tall like silent elders, I'd sit on the porch with a blanket and a warm mug, just in case. Just in case I might see a flicker of movement beyond the fence line. A flash of spots. A twitch of an ear. That unmistakable quiet swagger of a bobcat who once called this place home, and one night I did. Not Juniper, she was gone, of that I was sure. But the cat that appeared at the edge of the yard, standing half in shadow, half in moonlight. She had a crescent mark on her forehead. Luna's daughter, Mira. Full grown now, her form sleek, her body confident, her eyes just like her mother's, like fire waiting for wind. She didn't come all the way to the porch, she just stood there, looking, watching, and behind her, nearly invisible at first, were two tiny shapes tumbling through the sagebrush. Kittens. Mira turned her head slightly, looked at them, then back at me. And in that long, silent moment, I felt it again. That slow, certain knowing that I wasn't just a witness to something wild. I was part of it. Still, she turned and vanished into the dark, the kittens following her like shadows stitched to her heels. I didn't go after them, didn't leave out food, didn't do anything except smile into the night and whisper, "Welcome back." Because some bonds don't fade. They evolve, they circle, they return. And sometimes, if you're lucky, really lucky, the wild remembers you and chooses you again.